Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started in just a few minutes. Hello, welcome to UC Santa Cruz, and welcome to an evening with Jennifer Brea and Megan Moodie talking about chronic illness, care, and COVID. My name is Irene Lustig. I'm a professor of film and digital media here at UC Santa Cruz, and we're super excited to be hosting this event with Megan and Jennifer. This event is a follow-up event coming after a screening of Jennifer Brea's film Unrest, which we hosted last year in downtown Santa Cruz. And that event grew out of a research cluster that was a kind of interdisciplinary research group that met over the last 2 years that was dedicated to thinking about the body, critical disability studies, and creative research practice. Tonight's discussion is sponsored by the Humanities Institute at UC Santa Cruz and by the Institute for Social Transformation. And it's also part of our growing campus initiative on global health. And we'd also like to give a special thank you to Jessica Guild and Diana Hogue for all the time and labor that they've put into this event. So before we begin, I just want to share a few kind of tech and housekeeping details about this event. We're using a webinar format for this event, which means that there's no chat function available. However, Jennifer and Megan will have an opportunity to answer questions from the audience in the second half of the program. And we invite you to submit these into the Q&A box at any time. Your questions will only be visible to you and the question moderator who's off screen, but you can feel free at any time to just put a question in that box. We also will have an Asl interpreter on screen throughout the event, as you can hopefully see. And there's also closed captioning available as well. You can select that option down at the bottom of your Zoom screen in your audio settings. You should just see a button that you can press to activate closed captioning. And tonight's event will also be recorded. And then lastly, please be mindful of our guests' home situations. You may hear dogs barking or family members walking around in the background. And please know that we're all doing the best we can to ensure an uninterrupted event. So I will introduce our two speakers, and then without further ado, we'll jump into the conversation. We're extremely happy to be hosting Jennifer Brea at this event. Jennifer is an independent documentary filmmaker based in Los Angeles. She has an AB from Princeton University and was a PhD student at Harvard until sudden illness left her bedridden. In the aftermath, she rediscovered her first love, film. Her Sundance Award-winning feature documentary Unrest, which hopefully you've had a chance to watch, has screened in over 30 countries and had its US national broadcast on PBS's Independent Lens. She's also co-creator of Unrest VR, which was the winner of the Sheffield DocFest Alternate Realities Award. As an activist for people with disabilities and chronic illness, she co-founded a global advocacy network, Emmy Action, and her 2016 TED Talk, What Happens When You Have a Disease That Doctors Can't Diagnose, has had more than 2 million views. Unrest was awarded a special jury prize at the Paley Center for Media's Doc Pitch competition and was supported by the Harnish Foundation Chicken and Egg Pictures, BritDoc's Good Pitch, the Tribeca Film Institute, the Fledgling Fund, and the Sundance Institute. So welcome, Jennifer. We're super happy to have you. Jennifer will be in conversation with Megan Moodie, who's Associate Professor of Anthropology at UC Santa Cruz, where she teaches about feminist theory, disability studies, and creative ethnography. Megan is a writer of essay, fiction, film criticism, and drama. Megan's work has appeared in publications such as the Los Angeles Review of Books, Film Quarterly, and The Sapiens, and deals with issues including disability, genetic illness, motherhood, film, art, and daily strategies for survival. Her recent essay, Birthright, about her diagnosis with the genetic connective tissue disorder Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, which appeared in the Chicago Quarterly Review, was named a notable essay of the year by Best American Essays 2019. So I think that's my intro. And without further ado, we're incredibly happy to introduce you to Jennifer and Megan.
Irene.
Thank you so much, Irene.
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, Megan. I'm so happy to be here. And I'm particularly happy to be here because last year when we had, you guys hosted the screening, I wasn't able to come. And so it's just sort of a strange thing that now the whole world has become kind of, Zoom and video chat native, but I'm really glad that it has allowed us to have this conversation.
Me too. It feels like it's a year in the making. I think what we decided we would do is maybe just a brief kind of introduction to how we personally come to, so you just heard
Right.
Academic filmmaker biography.
Yeah.
And now we can talk a little bit about maybe a little bit of updating about life since the film in your case.
Right. Right. So, I guess, yes, that is the public bio, and a lot has happened before and since. And maybe the best thing to do would be to roll the trailer from the film Unrest. So this is just for anybody who is new to my story, is new to my community of people living with ME or myalgic encephalomyelitis. This will give you a little peek into what I lived with for almost a decade. And so here is my story in the documentary Unrest.
From as early as I can remember, I wanted to swallow the world whole. Anything was possible. I just thought I would have more time. I don't know what I did to myself. I don't think I can get up off the couch. I feel like my brain is misfiring. Sometimes I wouldn't be able to speak.
Wow. If you say too little, they can't help you. And if you say too much, they think you're a mental patient.
The doctor would tell me, "You're just dehydrated." Everyone gets stressed. Then I went online and found thousands of other people just like me.
Yeah, I'm completely bedridden.
It's like I'm just watching my life disappear.
I have ME, CFS, that's chronic fatigue syndrome.
Historically, you can see illnesses very similar to this called many different things.
Saw someone collecting the other day for ME. That's the one where don't feel like going to work today.
It's gonna pass.
Chronic fatigue syndrome. Yeah, I'm tired too.
When medicine has no answers for you, where do you turn? Oh my God.
It's like the craziest high school science experiment you've ever done. Just because it's crazy doesn't mean it's wrong.
You're looking at this camera.
I started filming more and more people all over the world from my bed.
Hi, Jen.
Hi.
You know what it is about being observed? It's that people feel sorry for me.
Baby, I'm so sorry.
I have the strength of a mountain.
We're kind of both organizing a day of protests as well as organizing individual protests.
All of those things, those really simple things. There's the sun. That life was gone, but here I have this new one.
And I'll take all you throw at me.
And I have to fight for it.
It's been a while since I've seen that trailer, and and I would say watching it is really emotional in a different way for a couple of reasons. one, I've had a lot of personal changes in my health that have significantly improved my quality of life that might be worth talking about for a little bit. But also, I think I felt rewatching that a certain degree of anger that is new and different than what was sort of fueling this desire I had the entire time that I was making the film, to be seen and heard, and to have this community be recognized and valued and destigmatized and researched, so we can ultimately get the care that we all need and deserve. And I think it's sort of, there are lessons in that film, but there are also lessons in the stories that patients have been telling going back decades that have been ignored and are a part of why we are in the situation we are in right now. I believe seeing so many people become ill with long COVID, which I think is a disaster that could have been avoided. And so I'm looking forward to kind of unpacking all of that with you and hearing your thoughts about it.
Yes, it was so different to see it now as opposed to a year ago, the trailer.
Yeah, I mean, because everything has changed and also hasn't at the same time.
Right.
And so
yeah,
I think that's a big part of it. And then for me personally, and this connects a little bit to sort of your journey as well, Megan, I ended up having what I thought was an unrelated surgery after the film came out. I was diagnosed with thyroid cancer. The cancer had nothing to do with my symptoms, but as when I went to have surgery for the thyroid cancer, the general anesthesia, which they have to intubate you and put a tube down your throat and often put your head into like hyperextension, it exacerbated an issue in my neck that had been there for a long time, but that I was unaware of. And I started having a worsening of all of my symptoms, as well as very, very long periods where I couldn't, periods of 30 to 60 seconds of not being able to breathe, not being able to move, passing out, really, really horrific symptoms. And I actually ended up being diagnosed with 2 different spinal issues that are typically related to Ehlers-Danlos, which Megan has, and which I don't meet the criteria for by a mile, but I ended up having surgery for those 2 issues, cranial cervical instability and then tethered cord surgery, and have had a full remission of all of my ME symptoms, even though I would not say that I am 100% well. There's some asterisks next to that. But it's been quite a journey. And the only way that the beginning of finding out those diagnoses was having a neurosurgeon watch Unrest, see my MRI in some montage, and notice some abnormalities that were suggestive of a problem that he was familiar with. And he emailed me, and that was kind of the beginning of this journey. And what he told me at the time was, I treat a lot of patients with Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, and some of my patients, after a severe viral infection, develop exactly your symptoms. And so that was really kind of eye-opening for me. And I think ever since then, I've been on a journey to try to understand what are the things that might make people vulnerable to developing long-term symptoms after infection, but also how does this kind of broader range of chronic illnesses that are sort of like illnesses of connective tissue disorders, of immune dysfunction, so autoimmune hyperinflammatory conditions and conditions affecting the brain, spine, and nervous system, how do these relate to each other? And how does the situation we find ourselves in tell us broader things about science and medicine? So that's kind of where I am right now since making Unrest.
Thank you. And it's, before I talk about sort of where I'm coming from, it is so nice to have you here, wherever it is. And I just wanted to thank you again, Jen, for your film, for Unrest, and for all the work that you've been doing despite illness, despite surgeries, despite all the everything. Because though our cases and our histories are separate, although it's turning out maybe not as separate as it initially appeared, I think I understand something about what it's taken physically and emotionally and personally to give of yourself when you're not even feeling whole. And so for me, you're creative, you're scholarly, activist, feminist, your contributions, they've inspired me. They gave me strength when I felt very weak and alone. And they helped me keep going when I thought maybe that I couldn't. And so I know I'm not the only one that feels this way, but I just really wanted to publicly express the collective gratitude to you. So,
thank you.
I have been writing about my medical odyssey since 2015. After my second, I've had 3 failed hip surgery for what was supposed to be a pretty straight ahead soft tissue injury. And so like Jen, my story is pretty episodic. It's got twists and turns, heroes and villains. But just to give a little bit of kind of general context to where I'm coming from, for the last 10 years, I've lived with intractable chronic pain, including since 2017, a diagnosis with complex regional pain syndrome, also called CRPS. And I'm not gonna talk a lot about that. If you have the misfortune of knowing about CRPS, you know that it's one of the most painful things that can happen to a human body. But underlying the twists and turns of my medical journey, the most recent twist has been a form of facial dystonia that sometimes affects my speech, which I'll also just mention because it may pop up with us this evening. And underlying everything has been a genetic condition called Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, or EDS. There are many types of EDS, but the kind that runs in my family is a hypermobility, or the hypermobility type, HEDS. That's characterized by joint hypermobility, skin extensibility, and fragile tissues, basically. Some types of EDS are rare, but HEDS is now thought to be relatively common among human populations. Like estimates are somewhere between 1 in 1,500 and 1 in 5,000 people probably have some version of this connective tissue or series, we're not quite sure yet, of connective tissue disorders. And it's a spectrum. So that means that different people are differently impacted. And also because it's collagen and our whole bodies are made of collagen, everything is made of collagen, patients manifest a huge variety of symptoms. So in my case, this is severe joint pain and joint laxity, dislocating things all the time, and these neurological symptoms that have a very sort of mysterious provenance. When I first wrote about unrest for Film Quarterly, I saw the film and I was at one of the lowest points of health that I've had in the previous decade. I was mostly using a wheelchair to get around. And most of my days were spent just like trying to get through hour to hour and fighting with my insurance company, which refused to pay for treatments that my pain team at Stanford thought might in fact help. And in fact, they did. When I paid out of pocket and we had them, they did help. Jen's film spoke to me as a sick woman, as a feminist, as a scholar. And at the time, I felt like it was really important to do this work of showing how unrest was part of a small but really important genealogy of literary works that demand that we reckon with the illness and the ill treatment of female, and here I mean non-normatively masculine gendered, so women is quite broad in my story here, female bodies. And here I mean thinkers and artists like Audre Lorde and Susan Sontag and others. And of course, there were also a lot of points of personal identification, right? I for the first time in a really long time, felt like I wasn't invisible anymore. It never occurred to me at the time that my actual illness might have anything to do actually with Jen's illness. I thought, okay, the structures are similar, but in fact, the diagnoses and et cetera are quite separate. And then I decided to write a follow-up about Jen's recovery. I was experiencing a bit of my own remission because these treatments were in fact helping. And as a part of doing this research, I learned about the structural issues that were causing neurological symptoms for Jen. And it turns out quite a few people with ME/CFS, and the possible role of connective tissue disorder, whether that's Ehlers-Danlos or something else. And a lot of buzzers started going off. So now I feel like this is the metaphor that keeps popping in my head. It's like we've actually showed up in the same field, and it's this big field behind a bunch of silos. And those silos are medical specialties, and we can't get in, and no one ever comes out. But there's a field, and it's filled with people who have, exactly as Jen said, some combination of autoimmune, neurological, and endocrine disorder that is involved with our connective tissue structure that may or may not be the result of a viral attack. And so now we're kind of like waving at each other saying like, wow, we really have to get all the folks in the silos out here to figure out like what's going on. And this is the last thing I want to say, because I think the important thing for me about doing this work, and I know Jen is a kindred spirit in this way, is that even though I'm talking about my personal experience, which for me as an anthropologist was also a little bit weird and different because, right, I was used to writing about others. But none of the work is really about me or even really about individuals. In fact, one of the things I think we have to overcome is the idea that illness and disability are individual. That's like the narrative that we want is, you know, a brave person who survives and perseveres and inspires the rest of us. That's always been the narrative, or is an object of pity. And that's the narrative, not to mention like the institutional life of disability and illness. You're separate. This is a thing that happened to you, and now you're going to be totally separate from everything, from the world. And, you know, when I get up, and this is, you know, similar, and I'm building, I think, here on ideas that folks have talked about this in terms of the history of polio, for instance, and how the entree of polio survivors into society changed the idea that this was like this individual thing that was happening. So when I get a platform to tell my story, like we're having this conversation tonight, it's not really so that I can tell my story, but so that it, on one hand, speaks to other people, like other sick women. Hi, sick women, you're not alone. But also if we get the ear of doctors or researchers or journalists, it can bring this more structural crisis into view, because like I'm here, Jennifer is here, we're telling our stories. Nobody can say that didn't happen, right? They can't say male emergency room doctors aren't, you know, dismiss women's pain complaints, because I'm here to tell you that they have and they do, and it's happened to me. And I think what COVID is doing, to kind of bring it back to where Jen ended up, is making this a different kind of moment. And it's one in which we know that the grave inequalities that exist in our world and in the United States have been magnified, and we have to grapple with them. We have to deal with them. But it's also possibly a moment of potential, in that people from a wide geographic area, people, you know, are getting sick at once. So it's very obvious that even though a virus is contracted by an individual, the disease is social. And like polio, if you have COVID, you have a cohort, which is different, I think, than even struggling in this, what I'm calling the big field, a year or 5 or 10 years ago. And so COVID is really making it clear that the medical system that we have, it's geared towards a crisis, fix the injury, eradicate cancer, come up with a vaccine, and it has very little to offer those of us who just don't get better. And people don't get better for years and for decades. And this is the thing that long COVID is showing, and that we're just gonna have to change because there's so many of us, and the individual, that it's the kind of, I don't know, do you want to say more about that pull of the individual story versus the social structures? And I mean, you've been very insistent. It's something I love about your work and your activism, that like, this is about me, but it's not about me.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So I had like 10 thoughts as you were talking. So we'll see what I remember, but I took some notes. And one of the things I wanted to say, because it connected to a number of things that you talked about, is I don't know if you saw, I don't know, have you seen Crip Camp? Or you have, I highly recommend it. And I don't know if you were able to attend the Q&A that I did with the directors and Judith Heumann, but Judith Heumann is one of the, she's an amazing, just really fierce activist as a very young person, and is one of the people in Crip Camp who, grows up going to the summer camp after she got polio as a small child. And it was there were a couple of things that were interesting about that. One was that she talked about, in the film kind of mentions like, oh, the polios and, the people with CP and people in, and everyone, it's almost like people come with like a crew or a certain kind of identity. And what she learned through summer camp was it was an opportunity for people with different disabilities to share their stories. And what they found was that everybody had the story of the individual, like my personal story, that was different from everyone else's story. But the story of other people living with a disability shared, many similarities. And then there were also similarities across the entire disability community. And so there's a way in which, in some ways, by that individual storytelling, people were able to see the communities and the culture and the history around this community, and also see the structures that were preventing people from living, fully integrated lives of dignity, and lives where people were seen and heard, and their experiences understood. And so I resonated so strongly to that film. I call Crip Camp my unrest, in the sense of like, it's what it changed my life, like watching it. And, and in the Q&A and elsewhere, I've had a chance to talk a little bit with Judy, and anyone watching this, please go and watch Crip Camp, and also follow Judy's work. She has a book about her activism. And the thing that she just kept coming back to again and again was the power of storytelling. And it's interesting because when you talk to documentary filmmakers, we all talk about the power of storytelling because we tell stories, so we think they're important, right? But it's like, it gets a little bit fuzzy when you think about, well, how does a story lead to structural change, or to like me as an individual concretely getting what I need? And what she said is that in the storytelling, it's very clear in the narrative arc of the film, like they were consciously designing this as they created the film, but they showed how individual story, self-story can become collective story when it's shared. And they also, I think, really showed how part of the power is, like nobody who is currently a part of the disabled community has enough power as an individual or a single group to affect massive systemic change. But they were able to achieve what they did in terms of passing huge legislation, getting major reforms enacted, in part because they said, okay, we're gonna band together. We're not going to be like the polios and the people with CP. We're going to band together, and we're gonna fight for everybody in this community, because we're going to share each other's stories, learn each other's stories, and then carry those stories. So, if I'm somebody who has, cranial cervical instability, I should become fluent in what it's like to be autistic. And I should talk to people with autism because I need to be able to carry those stories to my own community and vice versa. And that was really the model that she and others developed in the 60s and 70s and beyond. And I think is a real model for where we're in now, because I do think, there's a, part of the kind of social model of disability, right, is that it's society that disables us, and medicine is a part of society. And there's this funny way in which these medical categories that were created in order to be able, for some good reasons, to be able to diagnose people, get them the treatments that they need, research them, have in turn, I think, fractured this whole other generation of disabled people into all of these different spaces.
Yes.
And it's not to say that there aren't like underlying biological differences, disease processes that matter, differences in people's experiences that matter. Like, I'm not saying that the diagnostic labels don't matter, but the bigger structural problems in medicine and its inability to deal with complex conditions, to develop new diagnostics. There's a lot of, and the kind of really ingrained, I think, like gender and racial bias that also deeply affects how people are diagnosed and treated. I think those are issues that no one individual or diagnosis or community can tackle alone. And so I'm really interested in how can we use storytelling as a way to essentially do what they did before, through self-story, telling each other our stories, telling broader stories about our communities, about long haulers and people with EDS and people with ME and people with fibromyalgia and chronic Lyme and MCAS, et cetera, like how sharing those stories as opposed to fighting about diagnoses, which I see happen a lot in patient communities. How can that actually be a source of power, that we can be different and distinct, but we can also fight for the interests that we share together?
Yeah, do you want to say more about that? Because the work that you've done in social media, I mean, and you've sort of described the two faces of social media. On one hand, it does do this work of collectivizing, and people get really important information and learn things and support, and just being able to connect with others that get it. This is something I see a lot in online communities. And yet these diagnosis-based forums are participating in some ways in the, creation of these distinct categories. Do you want to talk about sort of like how you think now about, and I know in the film you talk about what it meant being in bed to be able to reach out to folks all over the world. And so how do you think about social media now?
I mean, I think that social media is absolutely the reason why you and I know each other, why we're all here right now, why the film was even made to begin with, how I was ever diagnosed with anything. Like, I even had like this weird diagnosis that came about a year ago of something that was like causing major symptoms, but it was a minor problem. And it came from someone sharing with me a paper or something really rare that my doctor would never have known about otherwise. And so I think it's a vital resource. And I think it's going to be a lot of how this sort of power hierarchy between doctors and patients gets equalized in a way that allows for us to share information and make research advances and create changes that frankly I think that many of us want. Like, I actually think the medical system is destroying the doctor-patient relationship, and doctors feel that too.
Yes.
And so there's a whole side of this that is the kind of medical practitioner's experience. That's like the other side of what I think of as the same coin. And so I do think there's allyship to find there too, but we kind of have to organize ourselves. And so I think it's really powerful. I think the thing that might not be about social media, I think social media allows people who have disabilities that prevent them from meeting in person to connect and find community and to keep living their lives essentially in a virtual space. which is really important. And I also think it is, especially if you have something that's rare or misunderstood. I guess that there were sort of downsides to social media or limits to social media. I mean, I think I never started this work intending to become a public figure. And that's been really hard because I'm both very open to the world and I want to remain that way. I think that's how I learn. But my own kind of story and attempt to interpret my remission has been a really complicated few years in terms, like, for my community, for people who turn out have these pathologies that I have, for people that might not, and how do we essentially start to like retell, like reshape our story around that when we're also still just trying to figure all of this out. And so I think what's required in a sense, and I think this is going to be even more true as there's more and more research on long COVID, which, some asterisks because we're still trying to figure out the details, but it does look like in the, over $1 trillion recovery bill, there's going to be $1.15 billion allocated to research on COVID over the next 3 years, which is like that would be like 75 years of ME CFS funding. So it's pretty extraordinary, and that's what happens when when something becomes a collective problem, right? It suddenly it matters. And at the same time, I keep thinking like, well, if we kept telling you this is really important, and if we told you this 5 years ago and 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 30 years ago and 50 years ago, and maybe 30 years ago, if you had spent $1.15 billion, there wouldn't be long haulers. So it's a kind of strange feeling to be in, but I guess I'm kind of going off the social media track. I do think the thing that is hard is that we are in these communities, and some of these communities reify the silos that the medical kind of literature has created. And what I see is that we have, what I've seen for a while is that we have organizations, and we have conferences, and we have patients and clinicians and researchers that attend those conferences and have these conversations together, but that it's very hard to sort of have conversations across diagnosis because people say, oh, well, that isn't my diagnosis, so therefore the frameworks or the tools or the what people are researching there isn't relevant to me. And one of the things that was incredibly powerful and transformative for me when I went out into the world with Unrest, again, the power of storytelling is, I remember being at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, and there was a woman there who, and actually this happened in multiple places in multiple screenings. Like the screening had stopped, the Q&A was over, like the house lights are up. There, I always stay and try to meet everybody. And she was just pointing at the screen, and this blank screen, and saying like, that's my life. And, and she was like, I don't have your diagnosis, but that's my life. And I was like, oh, you mean like the feeling of being disbelieved, the sort of the way that chronic illness changes your life? And she said, no, like those are my symptoms. Like that's what I experience when nobody's around. And so there were a lot of people who reached out to me who had very, very similar, clinical presentations, but they were in all of these different disease communities. They were in the chronic Lyme community, they were in the EDS community, they were in the POTS and dysautonomia community. I have POTS, like 20 to 70% of people with ME/CFS have POTS. I'm sorry, I used to have POTS. And
I have POTS.
You have POTS. You have POTS. And so it started to change the way that I started to think about things. And so it's like you put this big piece out there, and then thousands of people talk to you in the form of Q&As, like emails, interviews, and it made me think that the connections between our communities were not just in terms of similar experience, but that there were probably underlying biological similarities that haven't been researched. And a part of it is that across these silos, the researchers are not even really familiar with each other's work, which I think has been really difficult and frustrating. So I think what I would say of social media is that, I mean, there's many things that reify these diagnostic boundaries, but that it is in the storytelling that I think we start to build those bridges, I hope, across those diagnoses. And I do think social media, filmmaking, writing essays, like these are all ways that we can start to do that.
A lot really comes out of this, but two things I thought maybe we could talk a little bit more about. The first is just picking up right where you left off, which is, I know that in some of the ME/CFS communities, there's been an influx of folks with that they're calling long haulers or long COVID, and that this itself is a moment where the problem that you just described, which has really been the structural problem, is starting to break down, because these folks are popping up in Facebook support groups. They don't have a diagnosis. They're not diagnosed with ME. They're just people who had COVID and they're still sick, and they're trying to figure out these symptomologies, these concepts of symptoms. Now, you and I might have, now I have this, I'm like, oh, they're all going to have connective tissue disorder. You just watch. Oh, there's a bunch of money going into ME/CFS now. EDS is next, I'm telling you. And maybe that's true, because we actually are now reading, studying in this field. And actually, I think there's reason to think that's not such a crazy idea. But can you talk a little bit about what happens when, I have my own take on what happens when the sort of folks who've had chronic illness for 1, 5, 10 years encounter, either, let's say, someone who is a COVID long hauler, who is, just starting to realize that these limitations on their life are maybe not going away anytime soon, and they're starting to wonder if ever. Folks who are at the beginning of diagnosis. I have some thoughts about how those interactions happen and get shaped in ways, I think, that are both good and bad, particularly in these social media communities. I think it's really interesting that you referenced your own story, because one thing that worries me about these spaces is the sort of authority that accrues, just on the authority that accrues in some spaces. And so people, they get a big voice about things. But I'm interested in this interaction.
Well, I'm one of those people now.
I
am there, and that's been really complicated.
Well, you referenced it, so that's another reason I brought it up, which is that it becomes an obligation. I think it's a really rough position to be in. Do you want to talk about that, or do you want to move on?
Well, I don't know if that's so interesting. I mean, it is and it isn't. I think the thing that's hard is I do see people who see me as concerning, right? It's in some ways people related so strongly to my story in the film, and then I think people took a lot of hope and solace in both the message, but also that, hey, the community rallied together around this person and these people, and they were able to do these extraordinary things. And then all of a sudden, just like that, what? You don't have this? And also your model of your illness is now something that's totally out of left field. It's not anything I've ever heard of. It's not anything that the researchers that I'm supporting are currently researching. What is this? And I think I've tried to do a lot of work just kind of thinking through those questions in public, but I think one of I think that the kind of simplest answer is, well, a lot of really important breakthroughs happen by accident. And there are 1,000 reasons why I would never have gotten this diagnosis. Like, I think it was actually highly unlikely that I was ever going to get these diagnoses in my lifetime, ever. and so it's so now part of it is figuring out what to do about it, and also how to kind of make sure that we all understand that we don't really know the meaning of that yet. And that, I mean, there are a lot of other people who have, with MACFS diagnoses, who have instability in their cervical spines. There are also people with long COVID who are finding that they have different kinds of cervical spine problems related to connective tissue, even things I haven't heard of before. And a lot of people with MACFS diagnoses who have tethered cord syndrome as well. And so clearly it's a part of our community, but it hasn't been a part of our story. And I think that that's been really hard for people, especially because the platform I have means that I have a kind of my voice carries outsized weight because of the people that I'm in touch with every day on social media. So I try to use that responsibly and really do take that to heart. And at the same time, I also know that if I don't push against what people think they know, then like my doctor's first patient like me was 20 years ago. And I was pretty clear that people like me would not be able to get this help that I needed desperately in the future if I didn't speak up and speak out. So it's been hard. I mean, I guess I'm curious, you were talking, it seems like you have some specific ideas about like the pros and cons of social media. And I'm just curious what you were kind of thinking of.
I mean, maybe pros and cons is I am sort of maybe making it seem too simpler than it is. But it's been, I mean, more than anything, I'm just fascinated by it's almost like a wave rushing into two bodies of water connecting or something to see. I mean, I'm partly experiencing this in academia, right? Because there were those of us who were thinking about disability and working on chronic illness. And we, I gave a paper about housebound ethnography like 18 months ago. And it was fun. It was great. I loved my panel, but it wasn't, it wasn't the best attended panel at the AAA meeting, my professional meeting.
Well, you should do it again because the entire world is housebound now.
Well, now,
whether or not they're disabled, and suddenly you're like, oh, maybe this is an interesting thing we should think about and study and understand. Like,
and it's totally true. Some famous guy anthropologist used the term in a blog post in like April or something, and I was like, man, not
it's so
much because of the and it's, to me it's funny, and I mean it less as a critic. I mean, of course we're talking about it now. It's not so much to say, oh, that was so wrong before, but it is to say, isn't this fascinating? And now that we're here, what would be upsetting is then if those folks' voices became the only ones we heard. That's why your voice is so important. So, when I said like concerned about it's not concern necessarily in the sense of, a negative concern, but also we need it because there are people who've been living with this and thinking about this and have tools for this moment.
Yeah.
And I know.
Well, so just to kind of jump in on that, I was on Twitter a lot today. Like, I haven't been on Twitter to quite this extent in a long time. Maybe this is probably one of my most active days on Twitter, like ever. But there's a lot of processing to do around this funding announcement and also other just things that were kind of coming up. And, so one of the things that I absolutely learned from the disability community online was not only that like my story and the story of my community is part of this larger history, and that we have been here for all of time. For as long as there are Homo sapiens, we have been here. And I think part of there are moments when certain voices are kind of kept at the fringes and when they're brought to the center. And I think that broadly speaking, the voices at the fringes are always like harbingers of the future, right? Like Alice Wong sort of calls us disabled oracles, right? And so, you know, I've taken sort of saying like, oh, I did a lot of disabled oracle work. Then, you know, when I was saying this thing that like actually is like very, very true now. And I think that's true. You know, it's like, it's sort of, you know, it's like the, you know, I know not everyone here may agree with me, but I think that there is a very, very strong sort of turn towards authoritarianism and fascism that's happening on the right. And I hope that's not controversial anymore, but that's a part of what is happening in our society right now. And, you know, I do think that African-American communities were raising this issue since they have been in this country, but for a very, 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 very long time. And I always think it's like the seeds of the thing that's going to come that you find often in these communities, and the people who are saying, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem, this is a problem. And people in my community, which comprises people who got sick after a wide range of sporadic infections, but also in cluster outbreaks of H1N1, of a unknown virus that swept the US in like the mid 1980s, that they have been saying for a long time, not only save me, but also this is important because it keeps happening over and over again. And if there is a major pandemic, there's going to be a big problem. People have said this, and we just didn't have the ear to be heard. And so I guess I would say, I would hope that we would learn as part of this that we were always supposed to be listening, because that's how we're prepared for the future and how we make the progress that we need before the catastrophe happens. But that's not per se human nature, right? So here we are, and let's make the best of it now that we're here. But I am concerned a little bit with that problem of like, how do you both respect that there's all of these new people who are getting COVID, who are finding out that they have these long-term symptoms, who are having a different experience, right? It's like they're in a cohort, they are getting medical care, but there's a lot of issues around, do I have a positive test? Do I have a positive test? What do I have access to? And what do people even know? And do they have anything that that can help me? And then on the other hand, people who've gotten sick after these past outbreaks and sporadic infections, as well as non-infectious events that can trigger it. And I think that the challenge is, right, like you want to try to like respect the experience of these long haulers, which is unique to that experience, but is also part of a genealogy or a lineage that is both experiential and also probably like grounded in biological fact. And one of the things that has been really frustrating is now you see doctors getting long COVID, you see doctors getting more involved in treating long COVID and really defending those patients. And for the most part, I think that's going to cause a tremendous amount of good. Like the only reason why we know about past ME outbreaks is because they happened in hospitals and because doctors and nurses got sick. So doctors wrote about them and they didn't discuss the patients because they saw with their own eyes what was happening in front of them. But I think that there's this problem where even as we're still fighting the old fight as we fight the new one. There was a piece in The Guardian by an infectious disease doctor who says, you know, long COVID is not your straightforward post-viral fatigue syndrome. And a GP who was doing a lot of work on long COVID who said, I am working on long COVID. I am not an ME expert. That's not my job to become an ME expert. I'm too busy to deal with this. And and like I mean, granted, like this person I learned also has a lot of really hard things happening in their life right now. So I think that that's a part of it, but they have a very large platform, and it struck me as really painful to think like we're here right now. And if you look, I mean, just for anyone who doesn't know, and there's these images I've been sharing, are just lists of symptoms that have been recorded in the 90s, in the aughties around, ME/CFS, and it is like people develop not only like fatigue and post-exertional malaise, but like myocarditis and vasculitis and like all of these complex neurological symptoms and dysautonomia and skin rashes and like all of these things that we see in the long hauler groups too. And it's not to say that it's one-to-one the same thing, but when you have symptoms and signs that overlap by like 80%, you can't not know about what's come before, what's in the research, what are those patients' long-run outcomes. I mean, if anything, I think our value to long COVID patients is that long COVID patients' value to us scientifically is that we get to see what happens early in the illness in a way that we never do because it's a cohort, but
watching it happen in real time.
5, 10, 20 years, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And so the idea that the research shouldn't be directly, like the research conversation shouldn't be directly connected, and that clinicians and researchers working on long COVID, like it is people working on long COVID, whether you're a clinician or a researcher, there needs to be like total bidirectional fluency between long COVID and all of these other spaces of chronic illness that came before it. I believe that fundamentally, based on everything I've seen and based on all of the research that I've read and the doctors that I talked to. So I'm hoping up for that, but it's so hard to pierce through the stigma. And it's like, I'm just amazed. But our biggest
I'm glad you went back to.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to say that I'm glad you went back to doctors.
Is that like our biggest allies and advocates, though, like throughout all of this, has been the long COVID community itself. So I'm really hopeful that if we can kind of follow Judy Human's example and really listen to each other, and listen to what it is that we need and what we're afraid of, what's hard for us, our misconceptions or preconceptions about, all of these different people that we're encountering. If we can really engage in dialogue and understand each other's stories and histories, I think we're going to be fine. Because at the end of the day, it's like the patients, like, that doctor may work on this 16 hours a day, but we work on this 24/7. I mean, it's our bodies and our lives. And I think that there's a lot of power and knowledge that come from that. So.
Well, and I'm so glad you went back to doctors for two reasons. One is that I'm gonna start looking at some of the questions that people have been very generously putting in throughout our conversation and before. And one of the things that I know you and I have actually been asked about quite a bit has to do not just with what doctors like do wrong or the structural critique, but also things that doctors do well and what can work in doctor-patient relations. And speaking of the interactions, thinking about the possibilities, for instance, of, like I was just saying, the sort of older chronic illness community and new folks. And someone had just asked, how do you theorize this encounter? How do you think about it? But also, I think there's questions about what kind of activist work can also happen there. One thing I know has happened in social media spaces, for instance, is folks who have gotten diagnoses, because you've already mentioned, we both mentioned a bunch of times already, how difficult getting a diagnosis and getting any kind of treatment at all can be. And so things like advice for how do you talk to a doctor, right? I mean, one of the reasons you get a platform is because you're a filmmaker or you're a writer and you can tell stories and you are able to talk with physicians in a particular way. I've been really super lucky because, all the way through, I think my doctors have, much to their credit, seen me as much. I mean, I went to a lot of school too. I've been studying this stuff as much, if not more than they have. And I live in this body, and I've had many bad experiences, but I've had a bunch of great experiences where I'm really being treated as a colleague and we're like working on this project together. And so how can I help folks who maybe that doesn't come as easily to, or what advice can be given to patients that are in these structural positions of, we don't know anything about this. You may go to your PCP and they may tell you, you can't possibly be experiencing what you're experiencing. What do you do in those cases? I mean, some of the things I've been thinking about lately have been about like, particularly because I think your film has really galvanized so much in this field, and it's made me think about uses of film. And because I've started thinking about, narrative film and other kinds of storytelling are possibilities for things like scripting and role playing and helping, like that as a form of activism where, we can, those of us who have been able to get the diagnoses, get the referrals, can think about how we did that and can share that knowledge and pass it on.
It's funny because there's this video that's like still circulating online somewhere of it's like a training video to help general practitioners essentially explain to their patients their false illness beliefs without pissing them off. I mean, these are things like there's a lot in medical training that's like, the problem is not that you're not solving their problem, that you don't have a solution. The problem is that you're not explaining it the right way. And so if you explained it in a way that was more empathetic, then they would understand. And it's as opposed to like, no, we can see through the bullshit. Like it's like, that's really all that's what's happening right now. And it's funny because it's, I think some of the most honest conversations I'm able to have with doctors is when we're not in these roles, right? Because like they get trained to play that role and then we come in without any training how to play our role. And then we try to kind of figure it out. And so in some ways, I feel like a lot of the deconstructing of the problem has to happen outside of that space, like where we can have like really honest conversations with clinicians and medical students about the problems. But then I do think that, there are some groups I'm in where people actually help each other, like brainstorm, like, how do I talk about this? What do I bring up? Because, when someone says to you, like, what are your 3 most pressing symptoms when you have like 40 symptoms and you're trying to get them to actually like figure out what's wrong with you, it's, it can be very, very difficult within the constraints of like a visit to be able to do that. And so I do think that kind of coaching and peer support is really helpful, especially if you have a diagnosis or you provisionally suspect a diagnosis or many diagnoses, like talk to patients with that diagnosis and they can help you figure out like how to navigate the system and how to talk to your doctor more effectively. I mean, I was a really slow learner. I was horrible at talking to my doctors, I think because...
In what ways?
I knew way too much. Like not just about like the topic, but also about like science and statistics and probability and also just like I could tell when they were going on a train of logic that just didn't make any sense. And it was probably because they were like busy and didn't read my chart, or like they forgot that like the thing that I told them, it's like, oh, well, maybe X caused Y. And I'm like, no, Y happened before X. And so I don't think that that's possible. And it just was, it's I think there's a role that you're supposed to have, which is like, they're the expert, you're going in to see if they can help you. And then you're supposed to give them the information they need to be able to help you. And it's this sort of like transaction. And if what they offer isn't what you need or what you want, I think things can really go off the rails, especially when doctors start to engage in kind of habits of mind that are really about self-protective of like their ego. And one of the things I would do is I would just bring up research in conversation. And so it took me a while to realize that when I was talking to my endocrine surgeon, not the one who did my surgery, but a different one, and I was quoting, I had read every single piece of research on thyroid cancer that had ever been published, plus some guy's book. Like I read everything because that's how as an academic, I was an academic, that's how I approach learning about a topic. And so I would just cite like authors, like you would in like an academic setting, or like papers and their titles and their whatevers. And I didn't realize that, I didn't realize that at the time, but like the surgeons hadn't read any of that research, or not a lot of it, certainly not the recent research. And so they couldn't, there's a lot of kind of I guess, dancing to not show that you don't know. And I think that that's a lot of medicine, and like broadly speaking. And I think there has to be a process of just like letting down the guard of, you don't have to know everything all the time. And if you do not know, the best and most compassionate and humane thing is to tell the patient, I do not know. I do not know, I'm going to try, or I do not know, I'm going to help you, or I do not know, but I am still here. So like, come here and this is what I can, well, this is what I can help you with. And I think that that's a kind of evolution of the doctor-patient relationship that's going to take many, many, many years or decades. But
good doctors are doing it. And that's what I'll say. I mean, I think that if I had to, across the board, it's not just expertise. What has made the good doctor interactions positive is that they say, I don't know, what do you think? You know, what, and if I say, hey, I read this thing and I have this idea, that they'll think about what, well, I couldn't answer this question, but who do I know that might be able to? Like, where can I push her now? And also what the constraints on that might be. You know, I do want to express a lot of, you know, also, I think, empathy for physicians. You know, in some ways, I do see a parallel with being like a busy college professor, where when you have a student in your office and they need something, they're the primary focus. And so if there's 5 articles that you didn't get to read that day because, you know, the student came in and they're having a rough time, like that's what you have to focus on. And there's so much information that they couldn't possibly, you know, know it all. And, you know, I think there is frustration, and I know there's a lot of frustration around the structures, around insurance. All my doctors have expressed, in fact, I've had more than one of my Stanford doctors has been like, you want to sue? Let's figure out, you want a lawsuit? Like, figure it out. I'll sign on. I'm there.
Megan, you have a very special relationship with your doctor. I don't
Maybe
think
that's true.
I think it takes a long time to find.
But I want to go to this, the question of, and insurance is kind of an entree, because 2 questions that have come in that I think are somewhat related, actually. One is someone asking us or you to talk about structural crisis, and what we mean when we say structural crisis. And then the other was someone asking about the financial impact and implications of the kinds of lives that we have been living and the treatments that we are talking about. And I think that question, to me, that is also a question about the insurance system in the United States. So do you want to talk about the sort of the way that, so what you think of as maybe like some of the key
structural problems
of the structural crisis, what we're calling a crisis?
Yeah.
And then we can connect. I think I can structural problem in the medical system a little bit to the finance piece of it.
Yeah. So, you know, the honest truth is that I don't know much about this other than my experiences as an end user. And I know bits and pieces, and the bits and pieces I know mostly talking to doctors. And so I think like that's part of the like bridge we have to create, because I think doctors have a lot of problems that reduce the quality of the care that they can provide. But it's hard for them to, you know, I mean, obviously their medical associations, different organizations can be advocates for them, but they're like extremely busy, right? And it's a big morass to try to fix. And then I think patients just experience like, I mean, we're the carnage of the problem, right? But I don't think doctors really know the problems patients have, like not really. I don't think we really know the barriers that doctors run into, not really. And so, you know, it comes down to like a lot of details, and all of them are cost saving measures. Like people here always talk about, insurance companies, but like in the UK, the NHS, like people face the same kinds of problems because of cost-cutting measures. And so whether it's the government or the insurance company is trying to save money, everybody's trying to pay as little as possible, while still being able to like provide within a legal framework, like, reasonable care. And so there's like small details like how long is the visit, what ICD codes exist, and there is no ICD code for, I don't know yet, or like, let's try to figure it out, right? Like there's a strong drive towards diagnosis, which in some ways, I think shortens the time frame for diagnostics. So like you don't, I have like 7 diagnoses, and I have them in part because I was put through a gauntlet of neuroimaging that I've never seen anybody receive. Like nobody receives the same level of neuroimaging that I've had, and every piece of neuroimaging is better and worse at looking at certain types of problems. So I think it's that you often you need a diagnosis to be able to sort of escalate a person's care, but then you also, there is no way to kind of intensively examine and treat somebody without a diagnostic code, and that different diagnostic codes relate to different lengths of time that doctors can bill. So, one of the things that someone told me a while ago is like, well, if you could just make sure that the ICD code for ME/CFS is related to an hour of a doctor's time, that would change a lot. And I just didn't really
that's like, wait, can we put that in a chat? So can we are there any physicians in the audience? Can we just like, is there, that to me feels like, wow, isn't that a small thing that would be huge, that would be monumental?
But I guess the thing that what I saw as like bad decision-making was often actually just like what they had, like what they were supposed to do. Like, this is the factory line, this is the model. And it's cost saving, but I also think it has a lot of consequences. So yeah, I mean, I'm curious if other people have ideas or thoughts about this as well.
Yeah, if anyone does, let us. I mean, so every diagnosis is also then attached to therapeutic possibilities.
Someone writes, bring your own ICD code.
and this is something that has been a big issue for me, because I have been denied 3.5 years. I was denied the treatment that my doctors thought would be the most beneficial for me. And I went all the way through the California Independent Medical Review process, which is, now when we're all employed, if we get insurance, if we're lucky enough to get insurance through our employer, we sign these clauses, these arbitration clauses that say, if we have a complaint, we agree to arbitrate and not to sue the insurance company. In California, we have the legal right to sue our insurance companies. Some states don't, right? And we also have an independent medical review process. These like sprung up all over the United States in the late 90s with the idea of consumer protection, right? That there were some landmark cases of just horrible, horrible stuff. People being told that a cancer treatment was experimental. The one case in 1998 that was against Health Net, a young mother passed away while waiting for, being denied again and again, waiting for this cancer treatment. And then after her death, her husband was awarded something like $89 million. And the outcome of that case was 2 things. One was a limit to what those awards could be, and the other was these independent medical review processes. And so this is something that I've thought quite a bit about, because what happens is, for many of our diagnoses in these categories, there are no approved treatments. So I have this thing called CRPS. There is not a single treatment that the FDA has approved for CRPS. So anything my physician gives me for that is technically experimental.
That's true of so many conditions, because for a lot of conditions, standard care is using off-label
It's all off
but,
right.
But it's
so
like, because it's like, it's so expensive to get something approved for a disease that once you know it's human safe, like
right. So I'm just using it as an example.
Yeah.
That got denied was for CRPS. And so what they can say is, well, this is experimental. It's not approved for CRPS. But the argument is exactly the one you just made, which is, well, wait a second, nothing I'm being given is actually experimental. And so you guys are just invoking this as a cost saving measure when it suits you, you know, and you're ignoring it in all these other cases. And so if wasn't also me going to the insurance company and saying, I want this treatment. This was my doctors, right? My team at Stanford saying, we want to give her this treatment, and them saying no. And I think the abuse of the experimental category is another piece of the structural puzzle that will have to solve.
And especially because a lot of things remain experimental because they aren't researched, because there's no funding for people who have these conditions.
And exactly, and
this like chicken and egg.
And the populations, what we were told was that the populations are so small, you can't ever get to the gold standard, which is the large scale study. There will never be a big enough population. So that to me is another piece that is both financial and legal that will have to change if things will change for those of us in this
situation, especially because I'm sure, I mean, a lot of what people with long COVID will be treated with will be, I mean, everything will be by definition experimental until it's not. Can I was just also looking at the Q&A, and I saw there's a couple of questions that all hit on the topic of long COVID again, which we might return to before we wrap. And is it okay if I
go for it?
Just read a couple of things. I'm gonna throw out some ideas that people have raised, and then if you can frame it as a question or like.
Okay.
Go for it. So someone writes, I'm wondering if you think that this huge amount of money approved for long haul COVID will actually have the results of keeping ME in its own like grossly underfunded, non-legit sort of pigeonhole. So I think it's this idea of like long COVID will be researched here, we'll find out all of these things, we won't do the work to see if they apply to these other cohorts diagnoses, and then so therefore people who got sick before this pandemic won't benefit from that science. So I think that's one concern or question that was raised. I think that platitudes. There was another question about from someone, Kim Snyder. I don't know if it's like the Kim Snyder, but in case it is, I want to make sure that I read it. Oh, sorry. This is a different, not from her. It's a similar idea. I'm curious about the risks, challenges you see with long COVID. And with people with ME/CFS tethering their hopes on this emergent research area. Something about it makes me anxious, although I can't put my finger on why. And I hope our community doesn't miss out or mismanage this opportunity. And lastly, I'm so sorry, you guys. There's so many questions, this is amazing. Similar idea, like people, when leaders such as Dysautonomia International post about COVID-19, they get comments from patients who have been around for a long time who feel hurt and bitter that long COVID patients are receiving media attention and research when their communities have been ignored for so many years. The comment goes on, but I think that's, and Kim's question was about, does it strike you the term long haulers is being used in an analogous way to sort of chronic fatigue syndrome in the 80s, and that the semantics minimalize, trivialize, and confuse the public in the same way that CFS did? Those are the questions.
These are fantastic questions.
Really great. But it's a lot of obviously people with ME here who are trying to sort of help us sort of think a little bit more about these comparisons.
Well, I mean, one thing that I would say, I think I can answer this question as someone who's outside the ME/CFS community, because in fact, I mean, I'm paying attention now because I understand that a significant portion of folks diagnosed with ME/CFS who then seek out structural kind of explanations have connective tissue disorder. And so, you know, and because of the solidarity issues, and I want to learn about this condition. And so as someone who's like still really, really learning and watching what has happened in the last even couple of weeks, I want to say that I think you guys are well enough organized, and you have spokespeople, and good ones, right? You know, I feel like I tainted this conversation with this idea of the outsized influence of people. But you need the spokespeople are super necessary. My concern actually is that my concern is that actually folks with Ehlers-Danlos are ignoring this, like this has nothing to do with them.
Yeah.
That is worrying me, to be honest, a lot more, because like I said, my suspicion, many people with connective tissue disorder, someone had asked a question in here about diagnosis, and I'm sorry.
Yeah. Here's the thing that I think is something that I want to figure out how to get my arms around. And I know I feel like I'm not gonna be able to do without making people very angry, because whenever I bring up the topic, like inevitably I get angry. I get really positive feedback and really negative feedback. It's polarizing. But I think that I do think that the disease communities that I am familiar with, and this is probably true of every community, like they have some set of central, I don't want to call them myths, because stories about what this is. Like I'm in this box. I didn't mean to end up here, but I'm here now. And what is this box and what does it mean? And I think that every one of these stories is partially true and partially wrong. And it's wrong in a way that makes certain really important questions invisible. So in Ehlers-Danlos, for example, right, there's this neurosurgeon who, by the way, wasn't the same person who performed surgery on me, but he is the person who reached out to me. And he, when he said a proportion of my Ehlers-Danlos syndrome patients develop your symptoms after a viral infection, I thought, how come I haven't heard of that before? I was starting to hear that EDS is very common in the ME/CFS community, but I hadn't really heard as much about viruses in the EDS community, at least from...
No, it's never talked about.
Well, and then I saw a third neurosurgeon at Stanford, and he told me to wear a cervical collar because a number of his EDS patients find that their necks become more unstable while they're having a virus. They come down with the virus, they get more loosey-goosey, like all over, but especially in their necks, or during certain times of the month. Mm-hmm. And so if you need more support, wear a cervical collar. And I thought, this is something that heuristically, and informally, but nobody's talking about infection. And so the idea that Ehlers-Danlos is a genetic connective tissue disorder is true, but it's also incomplete, right? It's like there's always life history events, and we know that people from the same families, different families, whatever, a lot of people can live for a very long time, or perhaps their whole lives, without major disability, while others cannot. And some of that might be about the specific genetics and the expression of those genetics, but it's also about life. It's about, viruses and
a lot of women learn it by having kids, just like
pregnancy. Yeah.
Yes, pregnancy is a huge moment where the groups get flooded, and that was my experience too.
Yeah, and so I think the myth in kind of ME/CFS world is that this was caused by a virus. Now, if you were to soundbite me, that sounds like the most crazy thing in the world, and that was your trigger. It did something to your body that caused what is in most cases a non-reversible change, but we don't know what that change is, and why were you vulnerable, not somebody else? Like, is there a genetic reason that you're vulnerable, a life history, something that happened to you in the past that made you vulnerable, or is something in your environment, something else happening at the same time? Did that make you vulnerable? And so I think there's people are thinking along those lines. And then, I think in dysautonomia and in MCAS, there's all of these kind of central stories. And I think part of it is everybody's grasping a piece of the problem, but I don't think it's hard to see the whole picture if you don't create these bridges between researchers and clinicians and patients. So that's something that is very much on my mind. And I kind of want to I want to shatter everybody's stories, and see if we can kind of reweave them in a way that gets us farther and helps us help more people, essentially.
Well, we have about 5-ish minutes left. So maybe in those last 5 minutes, we could speculate for a moment about what that would look like. Like if we could build, because a bunch of people have asked to look, there's the storytelling, you've got a filmmaker, you've got a writer, and this is good, but what can we do to carry the message further, and what can we do to make things happen? And so thinking about how would we get folks to grasp the big picture? And I know one thing you've done, if you want to talk a little bit about working on creating the interdisciplinary team, the science.
There are a couple of things going on that are not exactly public yet, but there's a.
So imagine, let's pretend.
Hypothetically. So hypothetically speaking, well, and actually, so what's funny is that this is actually an essay I started writing, never published. It was a little bit like, imagine this shining city on the hill. And it was like, this is what happens when you have a serious onset of symptoms that nobody can explain. Like, what do you do? And for whatever reason, and the answer is not at least for us, the answer is not go to Mayo or Cleveland, unfortunately, right now. It's something that doesn't exist. But that is starting to be built someplace, I think. So it's less of a dream than I thought it would be. And I think what I want in general is to create spaces where clinicians and researchers from these different spaces can actually collaborate directly on projects. So for patients, yes. I think that there's storytelling collaboration that has to happen, and kind of information and social exchange for our own sakes. And that can be presented to, in ways that clinicians and researchers can digest. So I think some doctors really think more in cases and anecdotes. And then I think some people really, what's much more persuasive is kind of well-designed survey work and that sort of thing. I think both of those pieces need to happen.
Well, and so that's why I was going to say that piece of it that seems so important to me is to say, hey, when you're writing to the NIH or to the NSF, or when you're making money available, to remember to write artists and social sciences into it as well, right? And patients, and to make sure that when we say interdisciplinary teams, we're really thinking about
broadly. Yeah.
I was super excited to see over the last 2 days, the Social Science Research Council in New York under Alondra Nelson had this 2-day sort of the state of COVID type set. And it had some of the big speakers, Dr. Fauci spoke and others spoke, but I think a lot of the audience were drawn from anthropology and sociology and social sciences, but also drawn from industry, drawn from, and there are a lot of physicians, and that interdisciplinary, again, going back to where we started, because COVID doesn't allow us the myth that this is individual, which is the myth that gets to live when I'm just a person with EDS, which is rare, which it's not, right? And I don't have community, and I don't have any sense of the prevalence of this. And so I'm gonna have to make this whole world by myself. COVID doesn't let us pretend like this isn't a social problem, because we are being smacked both with the numbers of people and with how human-made the disaster is all the time.
Yeah. And I think, but it comes back to this idea of, I think we really need to fight very hard against the idea that this is brand new, right? And to understand, in some ways, it's taking, disability and disability studies and disability history and putting it back at the center. And it's also looking to the structural problems in medicine and the communities that were here before. And I actually don't think that kind of envisioning is something that will come from the medical system itself or from scientists, right? It will come from those disciplines that you talk about. And, I know somebody who, in the wake of, watching Unrest and then seeing all this long COVID stuff, who is kind of a self-styled skeptic in a way, who just didn't believe in all of this stuff until he saw the film, and then he went down the rabbit hole and he was like, oh my gosh, I was very wrong about a lot of things. I'm really curious about this now. And he was working, trying to work on, actually quantifying what happens if you don't get diagnosed or you get misdiagnosed. What actually happens to all these patients that the medical system isn't seeing, that I think end up just exiting the system and kind of trying to deal with it the best that they can. And so it's not a problem that the medical system counts. There's very few mechanisms built into the system to help it to see its own blind spots and to self-correct. And so I think there's a way in which social science, sociology, anthropology, political science, economics, humanities, storytelling and art and community building and activism, or all of that social work is what is going to need to be created to see the problem clearly, define it, and actually create the impetus for change. And I don't think I think doctors and researchers can ally with us and work with us, but fundamentally they're working within the system. And I think it's much harder for them to, we need their help to change it. They have to change it, but I think the vision has to come from outside. And I think it has to be something that we co-create across disease silos and disciplinary silos and sectors. So yeah, I think that's a great vision.
And I think that's a really beautiful place to wrap up. It went so fast.
It did.
And I feel like we could go on for hours. We can't see you, but thank you. Thank you so much to everybody who's here. I know a lot of you who are here are doing amazing work out there. And I know for some of you, even just watching the screen for this long was a sacrifice you made. And I'm just really grateful.
I'm sure some people are just there with their eyes closed, listening to the sounds of our voices.
That's right.
And one thing I would also just say is,
yes.
Megan's work is amazing. So you should really go and check it out. She's written many essays. I didn't actually read Birthright, so I need to do that because I am very curious about it. And congratulations on the prize. But her writing is beautiful, and she has the most, I think the clearest, just the clearest and most eloquently moving way of talking about this among almost any writer that I've encountered writing about chronic illness. So please do read her work. I hope she writes much more of it. It is so true. And I have to say that she has an amazing Film Quarterly piece, which is unfortunately behind a firewall, but the stuff it was the LA Review of Books, and then the Chicago or Chicago.
Oh, LA Review Book and Chicago Quarterly Review.
Okay. Yeah. But if read your writing, I think it's read her writing. I think it's it's something that I would love for everyone in the community to get a chance to sort of experience and benefit from. And so I'll share it on my social as well after this, because I think and hopefully it's the first of much to come. So I'm excited about that.
Thank you. Thank you to our sponsors. And thanks again to Diana and Jessica.
Yes, thank you everyone for this event and for everyone who joined us.